Monarch butterflies in Old Mexico. Our trips into Old Mexico were normally made in October, near Halloween, or Day of the Dead, in Mexico. In the mountains south of Monterrey there were times that the monarch butterflies were as thick as mosquitoes in a swamp. I remember estimating that they were separated by only 3 feet in the mountain air. In later years, I read that the butterfly migrated from all over North America, through Texas, and on into Mexico. It had been a mystery where they wintered before reproducing and migrating back into North America. In the late 80s their destination was discovered in the high mountains of central Mexico. They cover the tall pines in a solid mass with their bodies stacked together in the cool misty forest. We unknowingly were very close to this magical place and only saw it later in pictures from National Geographic magazine. Wild Woman Cave. There are many caves in the Arbuckle Mountains in Murray County, Oklahoma. Many are little more than a rocky outcropping. Others are very large caverns, under the ground, with tiny, obscured openings above. One of the most famous is Wild Woman Cave. I visited the cave back in the 1980s, but the years have dimmed my memory of the several journeys. I will attempt here to relate some of the impressions and actions of those visits. The name, Wild Woman Cave, conjures up visions of a crazy woman living or haunting this cave. Now after all the years we have the internet and I found the actual history of the cave name. Ethel Hindman was a young, pretty and nice young lady who lived 3 miles southwest of Turner Falls. She was an accomplished cowgirl and was very athletic. Ethel was not as much wild as she was daring. It is even said that when the barnstormers came through in the 1920s, she dove off the wing of a biplane into a local lake. Note, I have seen a photo of her diving off the wing of the biplane into the lake. She really did it. The cave was known to exist for years, but during one dry spell, it was determined that there was water in the cave. The Arbuckles are solid rock with little topsoil. It was decided to go into the cave and locate a pool of water that could be tapped. Ethel volunteered to go down the vertical shaft and find the water. She measured the direction and distance, from the opening, to the water's location. Then the men on top located the spot, drilled for the water and hit the pool. The well and windmill produced water for many years. It is said that the men remarked that Ethel Hindman was sure a wild woman. Ethel Hindman is said to have gone to Hollywood to become a stunt woman in the movies. Note, Ethel Hindman later married and had children. She moved back to Oklahoma and settled in Pawhuska where she lived to a ripe old age. She is buried somewhere near Pawhuska. As with several of my adventures, Randy Cochran led me into the spelunking caving adventure. He met a person that had been to the cave and raved about the sights and myriad of passages. Randy was given the name and phone number of the Oklahoma ranch manager and his location. The owner at that time was an oil man in Tulsa. He called the manager and made an appointment the next Saturday to get a key to one of the ranch gates and a general idea of where to search for the cave opening. We followed one of the rocky roads a couple of miles until the windmill appeared in the distance. As in the previous history from the internet, this was the water-seeking windmill that had been sourced by the wild woman, Ethel Hindman, many years before. Randy and I left the car and searched for the cave opening that the ranch manager said was in a rocky depression not far from that windmill. There it was. Just a tiny opening shaped like an old keyhole concealed in a small depression out in the middle of the desolate flat terrain of the ranch. The rocks and opening looked like a great place for rattlesnakes to seek shelter from the Oklahoma sun, and we both were reticent to stick our heads into the darkness below. We had no knowledge of what to expect, and this tiny opening did not meet our expectations of a cave with stalagmites and stalactites and miles of passages. Randy put his backpack in the bottom of the keyhole and then his feet and legs with his body and shoulders in the upper width of the keyhole. He then began to blindly push himself down the 45-degree decline into darkness. As he slowly began to disappear into the darkness, I would shout and he would respond with an echoing okay. Then suddenly, a loud thud, and a shout from Randy. The backpack had fallen into a well located 20 or 30 feet down the keyhole. He had been inching down the keyhole feet first, blindly, and only when the backpack being pushed by his feet dropped away, was he able to turn his body in light to see that he was sitting on the edge of another empty drop. Shaped like a 6 feet wide well, it went straight down into darkness. There was an old metal cable along one side and the sides were not completely smooth. I descended the keyhole and joined Randy at the well's edge. He then began to downclimb the 15 feet or so into the well. I followed. There it was. The well dropped through the ceiling of a passage that led off in both directions. Now when I say well, this was a natural opening into the ceiling of the passages. The windmill that supplied water from the cave floor was fed by a pipe drilled through the ceiling of the cave about 100 feet down the passage from our cave opening. We had equipped ourselves with headlamps, hard hats, and a rope for the first exploration. The weather outside was Oklahoma mixed with cloudy sky when we entered, and we had not checked the forecast before entering. We chose a direction and started walking down the cool dark passage to our left. After about a half hour of taking in the sights of flowing rock formations, we began to hear the sound of running water. As the sound increased in volume, we stopped to speculate about the possibility of a thunderstorm at the surface and if we were going toward the water or the water toward us. There were signs of water erosion high on the walls of the cave. After standing in silence and listening intently, we decided the sound of running water was getting no louder. Phew! Proceeding along the passage, the running stream of water came into view. It ran toward us on the floor of the cave, then dropped into a 3 feet wide opening in the floor, spiraling down a tubular opening and out of sight. On a later trip of exploration, Randy would crawl down the smooth-sided, spiraling tube until his better judgment brought him to stop an awkward inching return to safety in the 7-foot-high passage. On this first trip, we were in the cave about 4 hours and walked and crawled through a couple of passages but only saw a small part of the cave. A few weeks later, and now that we were experienced cavers, we decided to bring others. Randy, his daughter Alana, myself, my daughter Tiffany, her friend, a girl her age, Brian Atwood, his daughter Amy, and his son Trey. I don't remember their ages, but Tiffany was a young teen, maybe 14. Trey was very young, perhaps 8, and could run through the passages without having to bend over or crawl like myself. We brought food and after exploring a few new passages, stopped and had lunch in the cool interior of one of the larger rooms. We did the turn off the lights thing and sat in the darkness and silence until one of the kids said, "Turn them on." The kids enjoyed their trip and there were no negative experiences on this outing. After these trips and much later, I was telling about these trips to the cave, as I tend to do, to several of my friends and employees. They got excited, as none of them had ever been in a real cave, and asked if we could take them on a trip. I don't remember all of the names, but we had quite a group of young men and women, perhaps as many as 12. The details are vague, the ranch manager and Key were not home, or what, but we arrived at the gate to the property with no key, or permission, to the property. There were multiple locks, daisy-chained on the gate so that any one of the approved people could gain access with their own key and lock. We had 3 cars full of people after a drive to the middle of nowhere in Oklahoma and faced a gate with a dozen locks. Sievert Nielsen, my warehouse manager, proceeded to bring out his keychain with at least a dozen of those master lock keys. He began trying each of the dozen keys in each of the dozen locks and shazam! One of the locks popped open and we were in. By now, after our several trips, Randy and myself were confident in leading the group through the multiple branching passages of the cave. It is estimated there are several miles of branching passages. We had led the group, all of who had never been underground, to the very end of one of the passages, and had taken the lunch break and lights out thing as usual. Even though the females had expressed hesitance and fear, they had taken confidence in our experience and leadership. As we progressed on our return to the entrance, I began to feel uneasy and a little unsure as I did not recognize some of the terrain. After a few minutes, I took Randy aside and expressed my doubts. He looked at me and said, "I think we have never been here before." We stopped the group and told them that we were going to retrace our steps. We were not lost, we just did not know where we were. There were a few shrieks from the females and apprehensive looks from the guys, but we turned around and started retracing our way back through the passages. We had intersected a passage from the side that had gone both left and right. The opening was obstructed from view by a berm of rock debris, and when we started on our previous return, had walked right by the intersecting opening. Our return to the surface was completed with no other happenings. Exploring the cave was a wonderful experience. No rushing, not overly strenuous, relatively safe. My only fears had been when the rushing water sound made us think we might be drowned by a thunderstorm, and when we thought us lost. Learning to sailboard. As you should have noticed by now, Randy Cochran led me into many adventurous enterprises. rock climbing, spelunking, bicycling and etc. Back then sailboards were the new thing, before kiteboards, wakeboards and so. We decided to purchase a couple of sailboards and try out the new sport. As usual, Randy had read a book of how to, and upon arrival we loaded up the Volkswagen van and headed up to North Lake, the power plant lake just north of us. As a side note, the old Volkswagen van had been purchased by Randy as he was making his living working on Volkswagen Beetles. This van was completely painted as an American flag. Stars and stripes from the front to the back in true hippie of the 70s style. Well, back to the sailboards. Anxious to try out the boards, we ignored the obvious fact that it was still winter, but the sun was shining. At the launch area the water was shallow and so mounting the boards was easy enough in knee-deep water. We practiced standing up and balancing, and after many awkward falls into the knee-deep cold water we decided to up the sails and head for deeper water. Deeper water means that you must pull your body out of the water and onto the board, then balance on your knees and stand up. You then pull the sail, which is floating in the water, up while draining the water from that sail as you balance, and turn it into the wind. The learning curve was quick, and after about an hour we were quietly sailing around the small lake. What the book had not told us is that fixing your gaze on the water and the board to keep you balance, for some of us, will create a bad case of vertigo. We sailed along and suddenly the lake started spinning and I did an awkward flop off the board. Cold water, no. We were in front of the outflow from the generating plant and it was like a lobster being thrown into a pot of boiling water. Squirming back on the board from the hot water, I had to lay on the board while the vertigo passed and we could proceed like crabs escaping over the lid of the pot. We sailboarded a few times later, but the paraphernalia hung in the garage and was finally sold to some other unsuspecting stranger. Learning to kayak. Add kayaking to the Randy list of things to try out. Not sure where the kayaks came from, but I'm sure we didn't purchase them. The vision of paddling down a distant river, watching the wildlife along the banks and throwing in a line for the occasional fish, was too good to ignore. Again, the books explained how to use the special stroke of the paddle to right yourself after being capsized by some freaky wave or rock. Being smarter than on the sailboard trips, we decided to learn this skill in someone's swimming pool. It is not as easy as it looks. We did, however, succeed a few times in riding the boat without having to exit from the tight water sealing apron that must be strapped around your waist and sealed to the small opening into which you are shoehorned with legs straight out in front. So now we were ready for a real kayak adventure in remote rivers. Randy and I loaded up the kayaks on the American flag Volkswagen hippie van, and headed for the little river in Arkansas. Again, it was fall or perhaps winter and the water was cold. Swimming was not on our schedule, however, and the sun was out, again. We floated downstream for a few minutes, enjoying the ease of moving through the water that a kayak affords. As I turned to head back upstream, a giant hand intervened, flipped the craft over, and I was upside down. We had surmised about how difficult it would be to exit the kayak with the sealing apron attached around your waist. I hit the ice-cold water. The shock caused an involuntary chest expansion that gulped in water, not air, into my lungs. I was out of that kayak in an instant. Grab the kayak, swim for shore, empty the water and back in the boat. Repeat a few times, make a few more trips up and down the river, and the day was a success.